The judge had already reached for her pen, one signature, and Roy Donnelly would lose the billion-dollar empire he spent 15 years building, all because the homeless little girl he once adopted had seemingly vanished when he needed her most. Then the courtroom doors exploded open, and the daughter everyone believed had betrayed him walked in carrying a single leather portfolio, but what was inside was about to destroy a conspiracy no one saw coming. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The courtroom on the 14th floor of the federal building had never held this many people at once. Every bench was full. Reporters lined the back wall because the gallery ran out of seats an hour before the session started. Somewhere behind the doors, camera crews argued over sidewalk positioning, waiting for whatever was about to walk out of this building and become tonight's lead story. Roy Donnelly sat at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him, still as a man carved out of the wood he built his first warehouse floor from. He wore the same navy suit he'd worn to every important meeting of his life. It didn't fit the same way it used to. 3 months of this case had taken weight off him that he didn't have to spare. Across the aisle, Malcolm Sterling sat with the calm of a man who already knew how the day would end. He didn't look at Roy. He didn't need to. Beside him, Victoria Ashcroft reviewed a folder she didn't actually need to review, because every document in it had already done its job. The accusation was simple enough to fit in a headline. Roy Donnelly, founder and CEO of Donnelly Global Logistics, had secretly diverted company assets into a trust benefiting his adopted daughter. Fraud, concealment, breach of fiduciary duty. 3 words that had taken a man 40 years to build a reputation and unraveled it in 11 weeks. The judge looked up from her papers. "Mr. Donnelly, your attorney has had ample time to produce a rebuttal to the trust documentation submitted by the prosecution. Is there any additional evidence the defense wishes to present before I rule?" Roy's attorney, a capable man who had fought hard and lost anyway, glanced sideways at his client. It was the kind of look that asks a question nobody wants to say out loud. "Is she coming?" Roy didn't answer him. He kept his eyes forward. Ethan sat directly behind his father, close enough to reach out and put a hand on his shoulder, which he had done more than once during the last 3 months, without either of them saying a word about it. Ethan had watched his father build something out of nothing. He'd watched him get up before dawn for 20 years so that other men could sleep in, and now he was watching him get erased by people who had never driven a truck a day in their lives. Claire had been gone 6 days. No calls, no messages. Her office at the firm sat locked and dark. Her apartment hadn't seen a light on in almost a week, according to the doorman a reporter had bribed for a comment 2 days ago. The story had already written itself in every outlet that mattered. The adopted daughter, given everything, walks away the moment her father needs her most. Roy had heard every version of it. He hadn't believed a single one. The judge picked up her pen. Then the court has no choice but to move forward with. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Not quietly, not politely. They opened the way doors open when someone has decided they are done waiting for permission. Every head in that room turned at once. Claire stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway windows behind her, dressed in an ivory suit that looked like it belonged in a boardroom rather than a warehouse, which was exactly the point. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't apologetic. She carried one leather portfolio under her arm, worn at the corners from years of use, and she walked down that center aisle like she'd rehearsed the distance 100 times in her sleep. Reporters scrambled for their phones. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery like wind through a field. Victoria Ashcroft's expression didn't change, but her hand stopped moving over the folder in front of her. Malcolm Sterling sat up a half-inch straighter, which for a man like him was the same as flinching. Roy stood without deciding to stand. His chair scraped against the floor, loud in a room that had gone almost silent. Claire didn't look at the prosecution table. She didn't look at the judge yet, either. She looked at her father. For 1 second, standing in that courtroom in front of half the city's press corps, Roy Donnelly wasn't looking at an attorney in an expensive suit carrying evidence that might save his company. He was looking at a 6-year-old girl sitting on a courthouse step in the freezing rain, holding a backpack with everything she owned inside it, too tired to even cry anymore. He blinked, and the moment passed, and she was in front of him again, as a grown woman, with steel in her spine, and something in that portfolio that made her walk like she already knew how this was going to end. "Your Honor," Claire said, her voice carrying clean through the courtroom, "I apologize for my absence. I'd like to enter my appearance as lead counsel for the defense." The judge lowered her pen slowly. "And where exactly have you been, counselor?" Claire set the portfolio down on the table in front of her father, unopened. "Finding the truth," she said. "It took longer than I expected, but I found it." Nobody in that courtroom had any idea what was inside that folder. Not the judge. Not the reporters already typing headlines they'd have to rewrite within the hour. Not even Roy, who had spent 6 days wondering if his daughter had abandoned him the way everyone else insisted she had. To understand what Claire was carrying and why it mattered, you have to go back 15 years. Back before the Empire, back before the courtroom, back to a rainy night outside a different courthouse, where a struggling father made a choice that would come back, decades later, to save everything he loved. 15 years earlier, Roy Donnelly owned 2 trucks, a stack of unpaid invoices, and a 2-bedroom apartment that always smelled faintly of motor oil, no matter how many times he scrubbed his hands. His wife had been gone 11 months by then. Cancer had taken her fast, faster than anyone had prepared for, and Roy had spent the year since learning how to braid a 6-year-old's hair with hands built for engine repairs and freight manifests. Ethan didn't complain. He was too young to know what he'd lost, and Roy worked hard to keep it that way as long as he could. Money was a constant negotiation. Roy drove his own routes because paying another driver meant not paying the mortgage. He fixed his trucks himself in the driveway at midnight because a mechanic's invoice was a luxury he couldn't afford. Some weeks, dinner was whatever was cheapest at the corner store, and Roy told Ethan it was a treat instead of a necessity, and Ethan, being 6, believed him. It was a Tuesday when everything changed, though Roy wouldn't understand that until years later. Rain had been coming down since noon, the kind of cold October rain that gets into your collar and stays there. Roy was driving back from a delivery downtown, tired in that specific way that lives in the shoulders, when he passed the courthouse on 5th and saw her. A girl, small, sitting on the stone steps with her knees pulled up to her chest, a backpack clutched against her like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Roy almost kept driving. He had a route to finish and a son waiting at his sister's apartment, and exactly enough gas money to get home. But something about the way the girl sat there stopped him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't looking around for anyone. She had the stillness of someone who had already stopped expecting help to come. He pulled over. He didn't approach fast. He'd learned that much from raising Ethan, that a scared kid needs distance before they need comfort. He crouched a few feet away, rain soaking through his jacket, and asked her name. "Claire," she said, after a long pause. She didn't look up. "You waiting on someone, Claire?" She shook her head, just barely. Roy didn't ask more than that. He didn't need the whole story to know she needed help, and he knew better than to promise something he couldn't deliver. He called it in. Child services took 40 minutes to arrive, and Roy stayed the entire time, sitting on the wet steps beside a stranger's daughter because leaving felt like something he wouldn't be able to live with. That should have been the end of it. A good deed on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of story a man tells once and forgets. Instead, Roy found himself back at the county office 3 days later, asking questions. No relatives had come forward. No missing persons report matched her description. Claire Whitmore, 7 years old according to the paperwork, had nowhere to go. Roy went home that night and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at Ethan asleep on the couch, doing math he already knew wouldn't add up on paper. 2 trucks. A mortgage, a boy who needed him, and somewhere across town, a girl in a temporary placement who flinched every time a door closed too hard. He filed the guardianship paperwork the following week. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. There were interviews, home visits, a caseworker named Denise who asked Roy more questions about his finances than any bank ever had. Roy answered every one of them honestly, because he'd learned a long time ago that the truth was the only thing he could offer, that nobody could take back. Claire came to live with them on a gray afternoon in March. She didn't speak much those first weeks. She ate quietly, kept to the edges of rooms, and watched Roy the way someone watches a stranger they aren't sure they can trust yet. Ethan, for his part, treated her like she'd always been there, which did more to settle her than anything Roy said. One evening, Roy set a bowl of soup in front of her at the kitchen table. Nothing fancy, just something warm on a cold night. "Why are you helping me?" Claire asked. It was the first full sentence she'd said to him unprompted. Roy thought about it before answering, because he wanted her to know the answer was true, and not just something adults said to children. "Because someone should," he said. It took 6 months for the adoption to become official. Roy remembered the exact date, because it was the same week his second truck's transmission finally gave out, and he had no money to fix it. He didn't care. That morning, he knelt down in front of Claire in the living room and placed a small brass key into her palm. "This is yours now," he told her. "This house, this family, all of it." Claire looked at the key like it might disappear if she blinked. "As long as this door belongs to me," Roy said, "you'll never face another storm alone." She didn't say anything back. She didn't need to. She wrapped both hands around that key and held it the way most kids hold something they're afraid to lose. That night, after Roy had gone to bed, Claire sat alone in her new room for the first time. She turned the key over in her fingers, tracing the worn edges of metal that had opened this door for years before it ever belonged to her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire Whitmore cried, not from fear this time, from relief. Because after all those months of temporary rooms and unfamiliar faces, she finally understood what it felt like to have somewhere that was actually hers. She had no way of knowing that the key in her hand would still be with her 15 years later, sitting in a courtroom, about to become the reason her father's entire world didn't fall apart. The years that followed didn't move fast. They moved the way most real progress moves, in small, unglamorous increments that only look like a straight line once you're far enough away to see the whole shape of it. Roy kept driving. He kept fixing his own trucks in the driveway, kept eating dinner standing up because sitting down felt like a luxury he hadn't earned yet. But slowly, the math that used to keep him awake at night started tilting in his favor. 1 truck became 3. 3 became a small fleet. The rented warehouse got traded for a bigger one, then a bigger one after that. Claire grew up watching all of it happen from the passenger seat, literally and otherwise. She was maybe 9 the first time she rode along on one of Roy's longer routes, sitting quiet in the cab for 6 hours, watching the highway unspool in front of them. Roy talked to her the way he talked to Ethan, not down to her, not around hard truths, just straight, like she was capable of understanding more than most adults gave kids credit for. "You know why I check every contract twice before I sign it?" he asked her once, somewhere outside Richmond. Claire shook her head. "Because most people lose everything they've built, not because somebody robs them. It's because they sign papers they never fully understood." He tapped the steering wheel for emphasis. "Words on paper can take more from you than a man with a gun ever could." Claire didn't say much back. She rarely did at that age. But Roy noticed the way she went quiet in that particular way she had, the way that meant something was settling into her rather than passing through. By the time she was in middle school, Claire had stopped asking for the things other kids asked for. No new phone, no name-brand clothes, nothing that cost real money without a real reason. Instead, she started coming home from the library with law books nobody had assigned her, thick things with cracked spines that she'd read at the kitchen table while Roy went over invoices across from her. "You know most people your age aren't reading about contract law for fun," Roy told her once, only half joking. "Most people my age didn't watch their dad sell a truck to pay for groceries," Claire said, not looking up from the page. Roy didn't have a response for that one. It was true, and she wasn't wrong to have noticed it, and there wasn't much use pretending otherwise between them. They'd never been a family that hid hard truths from each other. It wasn't how Roy operated. And by then, it wasn't how Claire operated either. Ethan, older and already working alongside his father on weekends, took to the business in a different way. Hands-on, practical, learning the trucks and the routes and the drivers by name, the same way Roy had. But it was Claire who started asking about the parts of the business Roy rarely talked about out loud. The contracts, the liability clauses, the fine print buried in the back pages that most people never bothered reading until it was too late. When college tuition became the next mountain to climb, Roy didn't hesitate, even though the number attached to it made his stomach turn. He sold one of his best-performing trucks, the newest one in the fleet, the one that made the company look legitimate to bigger clients, without telling either of his kids until it was already done. Ethan found out first, from one of the drivers. He sold the 04, Ethan told Claire that evening, both of them sitting on the porch steps after dinner. For your tuition. Claire went very still. He shouldn't have done that. He already did. Ethan looked out at the driveway, at the empty space where the truck used to sit. So we'd better make sure it wasn't sold for nothing. Claire never forgot that sentence. It followed her through every late night in undergrad, every internship she took instead of a better-paying job because it taught her more, every exam she refused to let herself fail. She had made a promise to herself the day that truck disappeared from the driveway, one she never said out loud to Roy, because she didn't think she needed to. She would never waste what it cost him. By the time Claire graduated law school, Donnelly Global Logistics had grown into something Roy could barely have imagined standing on those courthouse steps 15 years earlier. National contracts. Warehouses in 4 states. A name that meant something in an industry that used to overlook men like him entirely. But growth, Roy would learn, doesn't just bring opportunity. It brings attention. And not all attention is the kind you want. The company that had once been small enough for Roy to know every driver by first name was now large enough to attract boardrooms full of people who had never driven a mile of freight in their lives. People who looked at Donnelly Global Logistics and saw not a family's legacy, but a number on a spreadsheet worth acquiring. Roy didn't see it coming. He was too busy walking warehouse floors, too busy checking in with drivers who'd been with him since the early years, too busy being the same man he'd always been to notice that success had quietly made him a target. Somewhere in a glass office across the city, a chairman named Malcolm Sterling was beginning to ask questions about a company he believed had grown too large for a man like Roy Donnelly to keep leading it. If Roy had kept driving past that courthouse 15 years ago, none of what came after would exist. Not the company, not the promise, not the daughter who would one day walk into a courtroom to save everything he built. Stories like this are proof that one decision, made on an ordinary rainy afternoon, can change the entire direction of a life. If that means something to you, take a second to subscribe now, because the moment everything Roy built came under threat is closer than you think. Donnelly Global Logistics occupied 14 floors of glass and steel by the time Roy turned 50, and he still couldn't walk past a loading dock without checking the tire pressure on a trailer out of habit. That habit was exactly what some people upstairs had started to hold against him. Roy's mornings hadn't changed much in 20 years, even as the company around him transformed into something unrecognizable from the 2-truck operation he'd started in a rented lot. He still arrived before 6, still walked the warehouse floor before he ever set foot in his own office, still knew the names of the mechanics, the dispatchers, the drivers who'd been with him since before the company had a logo worth printing on a jacket. The employees loved him for it. Some of the people on the 14th floor did not. Malcolm Sterling had joined the board 8 years earlier, brought in during an expansion phase when Roy needed someone who understood capital markets better than he did. Malcolm was sharp, patient, and exactly the kind of executive who looked good in front of investors. All tailored suits and careful language. For years, the arrangement worked. Malcolm handled the boardroom. Roy handled everything else. But somewhere along the way, patience had curdled into something else. Malcolm had started to believe that a company worth billions deserved a leader who looked the part, and Roy, however respected on the warehouse floor, had never looked the part in the rooms that mattered most to Malcolm. "He still eats lunch with the dock workers," Malcolm said one afternoon, to no one in particular, watching from his office window, as Roy crossed the yard below in shirt sleeves, laughing with the driver over something Malcolm couldn't hear. A company this size needs someone who understands what it's actually become. The comment might have stayed a private frustration if it hadn't found its way to Victoria Ashcroft. Victoria ran Ashcroft Capital with the kind of precision that made competitors nervous and employees careful about what they said in elevators. She had been circling Donnelly Global Logistics for over a year, watching its contracts expand, watching its valuation climb past what most analysts had projected. It wasn't the trucks she wanted, it was the infrastructure underneath them, the government contracts, the exclusive freight corridors that had taken Roy 2 decades to build, and that Victoria's firm could monetize in half that time if the right person were in charge. The problem was Roy. Specifically, Roy's refusal to sell, expand aggressively, or take on the kind of debt that would have made the company more attractive on paper. He built slow, he built honest, and in Victoria's experience, men who built that way rarely gave up control easily. Malcolm's dinner invitation came through a mutual contact, framed as nothing more than an industry conversation. 2 glasses of wine in, the conversation turned into something else entirely. "You know him better than anyone on that board," Victoria said, turning her glass slowly by the stem. "What would it take to convince the others he isn't fit to keep leading a company this size?" Malcolm didn't answer right away, not because he was uncertain, but because he was already thinking through how to say what he'd been thinking for months. "Roy built this company on trust," Malcolm finally said, "which means the fastest way to take it from him is to prove that trust was never as solid as everyone believed." Victoria smiled, small and precise. "Everyone has a vulnerability, Malcolm, even honest men. Roy has one that isn't even a secret." Malcolm set his glass down. "He has a daughter who isn't his by blood. Adopted her off the street, practically. If we can convince the board he's been quietly funneling company assets to benefit her, personally, illegally, we don't need to prove he's a bad businessman. We just need to prove he's not who everyone thinks he is." It was, Victoria would later admit to herself, an elegant plan, not because it was true, but because it didn't need to be. It only needed to be believable long enough to do damage. The 2 of them spent the following weeks building the architecture of a lie, disguised as a discovery. Malcolm had access to years of internal records, most of which meant nothing to anyone outside the finance department. It didn't take much to reframe old filings, misdate certain memos, and quietly steer a routine audit toward documents nobody had looked at closely in over a decade. Somewhere in those archives sat the original Donnelly Family Trust, a document Roy had created years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with fraud and everything to do with protecting the company from exactly the kind of takeover now being engineered against him. Malcolm found it almost by accident, buried in a filing cabinet nobody had touched since the company's smaller, simpler years. He read through it twice before he understood what he was holding. Instead of destroying it, Malcolm did something far more useful. He kept it, isolated from its supporting documents, stripped of the context that explained its true purpose, and prepared to present it as something else entirely. A hidden trust, assets diverted, a daughter secretly enriched by a father who had, in Malcolm's carefully constructed version of events, lost sight of his fiduciary responsibilities the moment sentiment got involved in business. Roy, meanwhile, remained exactly where he'd always been, on the warehouse floor, in the driver's break room, at his desk by 6 in the morning, unaware that 2 people in a private dining room across the city had already decided his 15 years of honest work made him easier to remove than to compete with. The folder Malcolm assembled over the following weeks grew thicker by the day: forged connections, selective omissions, a narrative built carefully enough to survive scrutiny, at least long enough to do what it was designed to do. He labeled it simply Donnelly Family Trust. Sitting alone in his office late one evening, Malcolm opened the folder one final time, reviewing every page with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd found the one flaw in an otherwise unbreakable foundation. He closed it slowly, allowed himself a small private smile, and said quietly to the empty room, "This changes everything." The lawsuit arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by courier to Roy's office, while he was out on the warehouse floor, going over a shipment delay with two of his dispatchers. By the time he read the first page, his assistant Naomi Fletcher had already fielded 3 calls from reporters who somehow knew before Roy did. Federal fraud complaint. Donnelly Global Logistics. Improper transfer of corporate assets. Roy read it standing up, then sat down slowly, then read it again, like the second pass might reveal it was a mistake. It wasn't. Somewhere in the dense legal language, buried between citations and exhibit numbers, was an accusation that struck at the one part of his life he'd never once treated as a business transaction. Claire's name was in there, attached to numbers she'd never seen, transfers she'd never authorized, a trust she didn't remember agreeing to. By noon, the story was already moving through every outlet that covered corporate news. By evening, it had crossed over into the kind of coverage that didn't care about logistics companies at all, the kind that only cared about a wealthy man accused of secretly funneling money to his adopted daughter. It made for good headlines. Good headlines didn't need to be true. Naomi kept the office running through the chaos, fielding calls, rescheduling meetings, quietly absorbing the panic radiating out from every floor of the building. She'd worked for Roy for 18 years. She knew every document that had ever crossed his desk, every signature, every filing. And she knew, without needing to be told, that whatever this trust was, it wasn't what the headlines said it was. Roy called Claire the moment he got home that night. "I need you to look into this," he told her. "All of it. Every document, every filing, everything with my signature on it." Claire didn't hesitate. "I already pulled the case file an hour ago." She spent the next 2 days buried in it, cross-referencing old corporate filings against the documents the prosecution had submitted. Something bothered her from the start, a discrepancy she couldn't quite name but could feel the shape of, the way a lawyer learns to feel the shape of a lie long before she can prove it. By the 3rd day she found it. Not proof exactly. A gap. Certain filings referenced in the original trust paperwork simply weren't in the archive anymore. Not misplaced, not misfiled. Missing, in a way that suggested someone had removed them deliberately, and recently. Claire sat in her office long after the building had emptied out, staring at a folder that told half a story with the other half torn out. She thought about calling Roy immediately. Instead, she made a different decision, one she would spend the rest of the case defending to herself. She needed proof, not suspicion, and proof meant going further than anyone expected her to go, quietly enough that whoever had removed those files wouldn't have time to remove anything else. She told her assistant she needed a few days. She didn't explain further. She didn't call Roy that night, or the next morning, or the morning after that. By the end of the week, her office sat dark. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Reporters who had been camped outside Donnelly Global Logistics found a new angle almost immediately, one far more compelling than corporate fraud. The daughter has disappeared. The theories multiplied fast. She'd taken a payout to disappear before testifying. She'd discovered evidence Roy really was guilty and couldn't stomach defending him. She'd simply walked away from a family that had never really been hers to begin with. Not by blood, not really. Ethan heard every version of it from people who should have known better. He defended his sister every time, though privately. Even he found himself checking his phone more often than usual, waiting for a text that never came. Roy heard the theories too. He said nothing in response to any of them. Not to reporters, not to the board members who started avoiding eye contact with him in hallways, not even to Ethan, who asked him directly one evening whether he thought Claire might really be gone for good. She kept a promise to a scared little girl a long time before she ever passed the bar, Roy said. She's not the kind of person who breaks those. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Roy sat alone in his study and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside, wrapped in a small cloth, was the brass key he'd given Claire the day her adoption became official. She'd given it back to him for safekeeping years ago, during a move between apartments, and he'd never gotten around to returning it, though he suspected now that some part of him had simply wanted to keep it. He turned it over in his hand, the metal worn smooth from years of use before it ever became a symbol of anything. "I know you haven't forgotten," he said quietly, to no one, to the empty room, to a promise made 15 years earlier that he still believed in more than he believed in anything the lawsuit accused him of. On the wall calendar in his study, red ink circled a date 3 days away. The final hearing, the day a judge would decide whether Roy Donnelly kept the company he'd built with his own 2 hands or lost it to people who had never once loaded a truck before sunrise. 3 days. No word from Claire. No evidence strong enough to counter what the prosecution had assembled. Just a father sitting alone with an old key and a promise he refused to stop believing in, even as everyone around him began to wonder if he was the last person left who still did. Imagine giving someone a home, a future, a family, everything you had to give, only to watch the entire world convince you they abandoned you the moment you needed them most. That is exactly where Roy finds himself right now, and if his faith in the daughter he raised means something to you, don't walk away from this story the way everyone in it is convinced Claire walked away from him. Subscribe now, because what happens next determines whether that faith was ever justified at all. The morning of the hearing, Roy woke up before his alarm, the way he had every morning for 30 years, except this time there was no warehouse to walk, no drivers to greet, no ordinary work waiting to steady him. There was only the courthouse. He dressed slowly, checking his tie twice in the mirror, not out of vanity, but because his hands needed something to do besides shake. Ethan waited for him downstairs, already dressed, already silent in the particular way he got when he was scared, and trying not to show it. "You ready?" Ethan asked. "No," Roy said, "but we're going anyway." The drive to the federal building took 11 minutes. It felt longer. By the time they arrived, the sidewalk outside was already packed with press, cameras angled and waiting, reporters calling Roy's name as he walked past, without answering a single one of them. Ethan stayed close to his shoulder, the way he had when he was younger, and Roy was the one doing the protecting. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Employees who had taken the day off just to be there found seats near the back. Some of the drivers Roy had known for 20 years sat shoulder to shoulder in borrowed suits, quiet and grim-faced, the way men get when they're watching something they can't fix happen to someone they respect. Malcolm Sterling arrived, looking exactly as composed as he had every day of the proceedings, his suit pressed, his expression unreadable. Victoria Ashcroft sat behind the prosecution's table with her legal team, reviewing notes she had already memorized, radiating the calm of someone who had already mentally moved on to what came after the verdict. The prosecution opened with precision. Corporate records, projected onto the screen for the entire courtroom to see. Bank transfer histories, dense with numbers that meant little to most of the gallery but sounded damning all the same. Copies of trust documents, Roy's signature reproduced beside dates that lined up just well enough to look convincing if you didn't know what you were looking for. Roy's temporary attorney did what he could. He raised objections, pointed out inconsistencies, argued procedure wherever procedure could be argued. It wasn't enough, and everyone in the room could feel it not being enough. The same way you can feel a storm arriving before the first drop of rain. "Mr. Donnelly," the judge said, midway through the afternoon session, "has the defense secured any additional evidence to counter the documentation submitted by the prosecution?" The attorney hesitated. Beside him, Roy said nothing. "There is none at this time, Your Honor," the attorney finally admitted. A ripple moved through the gallery. Somewhere behind Roy, a reporter's fingers moved fast across a phone screen, already drafting the story that would run the moment this hearing ended. Outside, on every screen, in every break room, in every Donnelly Global Logistics warehouse across 4 states, commentators were already speaking about Roy in the past tense, discussing succession plans, discussing what would happen to the company once its founder was formally removed from leadership. Employees who had worked for Roy for decades watched those broadcasts in silence, unable to look away and unable to stomach what they were hearing. Inside the courtroom, Ethan's eyes kept drifting to the heavy wooden doors at the back, checking them every few minutes, the way a man checks a phone he's certain isn't going to ring. Each time the doors stayed shut, something in his chest tightened a little further. Roy's attorney leaned toward him, voice low enough that only Roy could hear it. "Are you certain your daughter is coming?" Roy didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the judge. on the bench, on the space in front of him where his entire life's work was about to be decided by people who had never once met Claire, who knew nothing about a rainy night 15 years ago, or a brass key, or a promise made to a frightened little girl who had stopped expecting anyone to keep one. "I raised her to keep her promises," Roy said quietly. The prosecution's final witness took the stand not long after, presenting what the lead attorney called the most conclusive piece of evidence in the case, a document appearing to show a formal transfer of company shares directly into Claire's name, dated years earlier, buried in filings that had somehow avoided scrutiny until Malcolm's team uncovered them. The gallery gasped audibly. Even some of Roy's own supporters, sitting near the front, exchanged uncertain glances. It was one thing to hear accusations. It was another to see something that looked, on its surface, exactly like proof. The judge studied the document for a long moment, then set it down and reached for her pen. "Given the weight of the evidence presented," she said, "and absent any rebuttal from the defense, the court sees no reasonable path forward other than to suspend Mr. Donnelly's operational authority over Donnelly Global Logistics, effective immediately, pending further investigation." The room went still. In that particular way rooms go still, right before something breaks. She lowered the pen toward the paper. Roy closed his eyes for just a moment, not in defeat, but the way a man closes his eyes right before bracing for impact, holding on to the last thing he had left to hold on to, which wasn't evidence or testimony or legal argument. It was faith. Then, behind him, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a sound loud enough to stop the judge's hand mid-motion. Every head in the gallery turned at once. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun pouring through the hallway windows, was Claire. She wore an ivory suit that looked nothing like the frightened, soaked child Roy had once found on a courthouse step in the rain. She carried a single leather portfolio under one arm, worn soft at the corners, and she walked down the center aisle without hesitation, without apology, without a single glance at the cameras now scrambling to capture her arrival. Roy rose slowly from his seat, his chair scraping against the floor in a courtroom that had gone completely silent. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance between them, and Roy no longer saw the accomplished attorney every headline had spent the last week trying to erase. He saw the little girl he had refused to walk past, 15 years ago, in the rain. Claire reached the defense table before the judge had fully recovered her composure. "Ms. Whitmore Donnelly," the judge said, setting down her pen entirely now. "This court was moments away from issuing a ruling. I trust you have an explanation for your absence, and a very good reason for this interruption." "I do, Your Honor." Claire set her portfolio on the table, but didn't open it yet. "I'd like to enter my appearance as lead counsel for the defense." A murmur moved through the gallery. The prosecution's lead attorney rose immediately, his voice sharp with objection. "Your Honor, Ms. Donnelly is the defendant's adopted daughter and the named beneficiary at the center of this entire case. She cannot possibly serve as impartial counsel." Claire didn't flinch. "They made my adoption the center of their accusations," she said, turning to face him directly. "That gives me every right to be the one who answers them." The judge studied Claire for a long moment, weighing the objection against something in Claire's expression that suggested she hadn't walked into this courtroom unprepared. "I'll allow it," she said finally. "But, counselor, whatever you have, you'd better have it now." Claire opened the portfolio. She withdrew a document considerably thicker than anything the prosecution had presented over the course of the trial, its pages worn at the edges, clearly handled and referenced many times over many years. She approached the bench and requested permission to enter it into evidence. The judge granted it. "This is the original Founders Trust," Claire said, "established by Roy Donnelly 19 years ago. Unlike the fragments presented by the prosecution, this document includes every attachment, every amendment, and every filing associated with it since its creation." She began walking the courtroom through it, page by page, her voice steady in a way that filled the silence left behind by 6 days of speculation about where she'd been and what she'd been doing. "The trust," she explained, had never been created to enrich her. It predated her adoption's 10th anniversary by 2 years and predated Donnelley Global Logistics becoming a national corporation by nearly a decade. Its sole purpose, laid out explicitly in language the prosecution's exhibits had conveniently omitted, was to protect the company's founding values in the event that dishonest directors ever attempted to seize control through manipulation or fraud. In other words, Claire said, the very document being used to accuse my father of theft was written specifically to prevent theft like this from succeeding. The courtroom's energy shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The way a room shifts when the story it thought it understood starts coming apart at the seams. Malcolm Sterling's expression remained composed, but his hand, resting on the table in front of him, had gone very still. Claire produced a second stack of documents, annual renewal filings, each one dated, each one signed, proving the trust had remained legally active and properly maintained every single year since its creation. If this trust were the fraudulent instrument the prosecution claims, Claire said, it would not have survived 19 years of annual review. Someone would have caught it. Someone did catch it. Which is why I'd like to call Naomi Fletcher to the stand. Naomi rose from the gallery, smoothing her jacket as she made her way to the witness box, her expression calm in the way of someone who had spent 18 years keeping other people's secrets and was finally being asked to tell the truth instead. Under Claire's questioning, Naomi confirmed what the documents already suggested. Every trust filing had crossed her desk personally over the years. Every renewal had been submitted on time, properly notarized, properly archived. And to your knowledge, Claire asked, were these filings ever missing from the company archive prior to this litigation? No, Naomi said. They were there. I filed them myself, every year, without exception. Then can you explain, Claire said, why the prosecution's exhibits reference gaps in this documentation that, according to your records, should never have existed? Naomi hesitated for the first time, glancing briefly toward Malcolm before answering. There's only one way records like that go missing from a secured archive, she said. Someone with executive access removes them, deliberately. And who, Claire asked, has that level of access to the corporate archive? Naomi's eyes moved to the prosecution's table. Malcolm Sterling. The courtroom erupted into overlapping whispers, loud enough that the judge had to call for order twice before the room settled. Reporters who had spent the last week writing about a runaway daughter were now rewriting their leads in real time, phones angled toward the front of the room, capturing every second of a story that had just turned itself inside out. Malcolm's composure, so carefully maintained through 11 weeks of proceedings, finally cracked, just slightly, just enough for anyone watching closely to notice the shift in his posture, the tightening around his jaw. Roy sat perfectly still beside his daughter, watching the momentum of the entire case bend in a direction he hadn't dared to hope for 6 days earlier, when all he'd had to hold on to was an old brass key and a promise he refused to stop believing in. The judge called for a brief recess to allow the court to review the newly submitted evidence, but before she did, she looked directly at Claire with an expression that had shifted considerably from the skepticism of 20 minutes earlier. "Counselor," she said, "I want to be very clear that the court takes allegations of evidence tampering extremely seriously. If what you're suggesting is accurate, this case looks very different than it did an hour ago." "It is accurate, Your Honor," Claire said, "and what I've presented so far is only the beginning." As the courtroom broke for recess, reporters flooding into the hallway to file updates, Roy finally allowed himself to look at his daughter the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in 6 days. "Where were you?" he asked quietly, once the noise around them had thinned enough for the question to be just between them. Claire closed the portfolio gently, her hand resting on top of it. "Making sure they never got the chance to do this to us again," she said. When the courtroom reconvened, Claire was no longer playing defense. She stood before the bench with the same portfolio, thicker now, with everything she'd added to it over the recess, and the shift in her posture told the room before her words did. She wasn't protecting her father anymore. She was prosecuting the people who had tried to destroy him. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit a series of internal communications obtained through legal discovery over the past week. The judge nodded, and Claire began laying out documents across the evidence table with the precision of someone who had spent 6 sleepless nights making sure every piece fit exactly where it needed to. Executive emails, dated across the past 8 months, traced a pattern that started subtle and grew increasingly explicit. Board communications discussing Roy's leadership and language that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with optics. Financial records showing consulting fees paid out to shell entities that, on the surface, appeared unconnected to anyone in the room. These payments, Claire said, projecting a financial summary onto the screen, total just over $4 million, distributed across 6 separate accounts over the last year. Each account traces back, through several intermediary transactions, to Ashcroft Capital. Victoria Ashcroft's legal team rose in unison. Objection, Your Honor. Correlation isn't causation. My client's firm has legitimate business dealings across dozens of companies. I'd agree with you, Claire said, before the judge could rule, if the timing weren't so specific. 3 of these payments were made directly to Malcolm Sterling's personal holding company, within 72 hours of key filings being altered in the corporate archive. She pulled up the next exhibit. Bank transfer records, certified by a forensic accountant Claire had brought in during her 6 days of silence, cross-referencing dates so precisely that the pattern became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The prosecution built its case on the theory that my father secretly enriched me through a fraudulent trust, Claire continued. What I'm presenting instead is evidence that Mr. Sterling and Miss Ashcroft conspired to manufacture that appearance, specifically so the board would remove my father and clear the way for a hostile acquisition of Donnelly Global Logistics at a fraction of its actual value. The courtroom had gone rigid with attention. Even the reporters in the back had stopped typing, phones held up instead to capture the moment rather than transcribe it. Claire wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording, obtained legally, with all appropriate consent, documented in the accompanying filing. The judge granted permission. Claire set a small recorder on the evidence table and pressed play. A man's voice filled the courtroom, unfamiliar to most of the gallery, but instantly recognizable to Claire, who had sat across from him 6 days earlier in a private meeting she'd requested specifically to capture exactly this conversation. We don't need you to testify against your father. We're not asking you to say anything at all. We just need you to disappear for a while. Take some time. A firm like ours could make that time very comfortable for you. Claire's own voice followed, calm and measured. And if I refuse, then the case proceeds exactly as planned. Either way, the outcome doesn't change. We just thought you deserved to be compensated for staying out of it. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that courtroom now understood, in the space of 30 seconds, exactly why Claire had vanished for 6 days. She hadn't abandoned her father. She hadn't been bought. She had walked directly into the heart of the conspiracy against him, sat across from the people trying to destroy his life's work, and let them believe their plan was succeeding, while she quietly gathered everything she needed to unravel it. Roy sat motionless beside his attorney, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his daughter standing at the front of the courtroom. He hadn't known. Not any of it. Not the meeting, not the recording, not the 6 days she'd spent doing exactly what he'd raised her to do, finding the truth, no matter what it cost her to find it. He lowered his head, not from the weight of the accusations anymore, but from something else entirely. Pride, heavier than anything he'd carried in 15 years of building a company from nothing. The frightened little girl he'd found on a courthouse step in the rain had grown into a woman capable of standing in a federal courtroom and dismantling a conspiracy built by people with far more resources and far less integrity than she had. Victoria Ashcroft's composure, so carefully maintained through 11 weeks of proceedings, finally gave way entirely. She turned to her legal team, whispering something urgent, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. Malcolm Sterling stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, his face pale in a way that told the entire courtroom everything his silence wouldn't. The judge allowed the recording to be entered into evidence, her expression grave as she reviewed the transcript alongside it. "Counselor," she said, addressing Claire directly, "this court will need time to fully review everything presented today. But I want to be clear about what I'm seeing so far. What began as a fraud case against your father appears to have become something considerably more serious, involving the parties who brought it." "That's my understanding as well, Your Honor," Claire said. Roy's attorney leaned toward him, voice low. "She just turned the entire case inside out." Roy didn't answer right away. He was still watching Claire, still absorbing the 6 days of silence that had nearly broken him, now fully explained by 6 days of quiet, deliberate courage he hadn't known she possessed until this exact moment. He thought of a rainy night 15 years ago, a frightened girl who wouldn't ask for help even when she desperately needed it. He'd wondered back then what kind of woman she might become, if given the chance. He never could have imagined this. The courtroom hadn't fully settled from the recording when Claire returned to the evidence table and withdrew one final document from the bottom of her portfolio, the one she'd saved for last on purpose. "Your Honor, I'd like to draw the court's attention to a provision within the original Founders Trust that hasn't yet been discussed. Section 14, subsection 3. The judge accepted the document and began reading, her expression shifting slightly as she moved through the dense legal language. Claire waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of what she was about to explain to settle over the room. "This clause," Claire said, once the judge looked up, "establishes what my father called a protective safeguard when he drafted this trust 19 years ago. It states that in the event any party attempts to seize control of Donnelly Global Logistics by exploiting the founder's family relationships, manufacturing false accusations, or manipulating corporate records to remove him from leadership, temporary voting authority over the company transfers immediately and automatically to the trust's designated legal protector." She paused. "I am that protector. I was appointed to the role 11 years ago, when I passed the bar and my father formally updated the trust to reflect it." Roy sat up slightly straighter beside his attorney, his eyes moving between his daughter and the document now resting in the judge's hands. He knew the trust existed. He'd drafted it himself, years earlier, in a lawyer's office on a quiet afternoon when Donnelly Global Logistics was still small enough that the idea of someone trying to steal it felt almost theoretical. He remembered adding the protective clause almost as an afterthought, a precaution he'd hoped he would never need. He had not remembered, until this exact moment, that Claire was the name he'd written into it. "In simpler terms," Claire continued, addressing the judge directly, "the moment Mr. Sterling and Miss Ashcroft attempted to use my adoption and my relationship with my father as the basis for removing him from the company, they triggered the very safeguard that document was designed to enforce. They didn't find a weakness in my father's company. They activated its strongest protection, without realizing what they were doing." Malcolm Sterling's attorney rose immediately. "Your Honor, this is an extraordinary claim with no prior notice given to opposing counsel. We request time to review the authenticity of this provision before the court considers it." "Granted," the judge said. "But, Counselor," she added, looking toward Malcolm's table, "I'd remind you that your own witness confirmed under oath that these filings were removed from the archive by someone with executive access. If this provision is authenticated, and I have no reason at this stage to believe it won't be, the implications for your client extend well beyond this civil matter." The recess that followed lasted just under 2 hours. Claire spent most of it in a small conference room down the hall with Roy and Ethan, the three of them saying very little, the exhaustion of the past 6 days finally settling over Claire now that the hardest part of her work was behind her. "You could have told me," Roy said quietly, "at one point, not as an accusation, but as something closer to disbelief. Any of it, all of it." "If I'd told you," Claire said, "you would have tried to protect me from doing it, and I needed you to believe I was gone, the same way they needed to believe it. It was the only way to get close enough to prove what they were doing." Roy didn't have a response for that right away. He simply reached over and took her hand, the way he had on a rainy courthouse step 15 years earlier, and held it until the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. When the judge returned, her expression had settled into something resolute. The court has reviewed the provision in question alongside independent verification of its filing history, she said. I find the document authentic and its terms enforceable. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding tampering with corporate records and attempted coercion of a witness, this court has no choice but to reach the following conclusions. The courtroom held its breath. Mr. Donnelly retains full authority as Chief Executive Officer of Donnelly Global Logistics, effective immediately. The petition to suspend his operational control is denied in its entirety. A wave of quiet exhales moved through the gallery, employees gripping each other's hands, Ethan closing his eyes briefly beside Roy. Furthermore, the judge continued, the attempted hostile acquisition proceedings initiated by Ashcroft Capital are suspended pending a full federal investigation into evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and corporate fraud. Mr. Sterling is removed from all corporate authority within Donnelly Global Logistics, effective immediately, pending the outcome of that investigation. Malcolm didn't move. He sat frozen at the table, where he had spent 11 weeks so certain of the outcome, watching that certainty collapse in the span of a single afternoon. Ms. Ashcroft, the judge added, given the evidence of coordinated financial misconduct and attempted coercion presented today, this court is referring this matter directly to federal prosecutors for further criminal review. Victoria's expression, so composed through every prior session, finally broke into something closer to panic as her legal team leaned in around her, already discussing damage control in urgent, hushed tones. The gallery erupted the moment the judge finished speaking. Employees who had sat through 11 weeks of hearings embraced each other in the aisles. Reporters rushed for the exits, phones already pressed to their ears, racing to be first, with a story that had transformed completely from what they'd walked in expecting to cover. Roy sat very still through all of it, absorbing the sound around him, the relief of employees who had feared losing their jobs, the disbelief of a boardroom conspiracy unraveling in real time, the simple fact that he still held the company he'd built from nothing. But none of that was what he was thinking about. He was thinking about a rainy night 15 years earlier, a frightened girl on a courthouse step who had stopped expecting anyone to help her, a brass key placed in a small palm, and a promise made without any expectation of ever needing it returned. Donnelly Global Logistics had not been saved by billionaires, or politicians, or influence of any kind. It had been saved by a daughter who had refused, even under pressure, even under 6 days of suspicion from the very people who loved her most, to abandon the father who had once refused to walk past her. Claire turned to him as the courtroom continued to erupt around them, and for the first time since this had all begun, Roy saw something in her expression that looked almost like relief. "It's over," she said. Roy pulled her into an embrace, right there in the middle of the chaos, and said nothing at all, because there wasn't a single word that could carry the weight of what he was feeling. The crowd outside the courthouse thinned slowly through the afternoon, reporters peeling off one by one to file their stories, employees drifting back toward the parking garage in 2s and 3s, still talking in the low, disbelieving tones of people who had watched something they'd need time to fully process. Roy and Claire stood near the courthouse steps long after most of it had cleared, neither of them in any hurry to leave. For a long moment, neither said anything. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only exists between people who have already said the important things to each other in other ways, over other years, and don't need words to fill every space. Roy finally broke it. "I never adopted you because I thought one day you'd save me," he said. "I know," Claire said. "You simply taught me what family does." Claire smiled, small and tired, the exhaustion of 6 sleepless days finally catching up with her now that there was nothing left to outrun. "You taught me that first," she said. "I just learned it well enough to give it back." Roy shook his head slowly, still working through everything the day had cost them both. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what this put you through. The headlines, the suspicion, people questioning whether you'd abandoned me. You didn't deserve any of that." Claire considered that for a moment before answering. "They tried to use my past against me," she said. "The fact that I wasn't yours by blood. The fact that I came from nothing. They thought that made me a weakness they could exploit." She looked at him directly. But my past isn't something I'm ashamed of. It's where I found my father. They never understood that turning it into a weapon would only prove how little they understood about what actually happened between us. Ethan reached them a few minutes later, having stayed behind to shake hands with some of the drivers who'd waited outside the courtroom all day for news. He didn't say anything when he reached them. He simply stepped into the space between his father and sister, and the three of them stood there together, arms around each other, in a silence that said more than any of the testimony from the past 11 weeks. The weeks that followed moved fast, faster than any of them expected after a case that had crawled along for so long. Federal investigators opened a full inquiry into Malcolm Sterling's conduct, uncovering additional evidence of financial misconduct that extended beyond the Donnelly case entirely. He was formally removed from every board position he held across multiple companies within days. Victoria Ashcroft's firm faced its own reckoning, a cascade of civil suits and regulatory scrutiny that would occupy her legal team for years. Her reputation among investors permanently altered by a single recorded conversation she'd never imagined would surface. Donnelly Global Logistics, meanwhile, began the work of rebuilding trust with a board that had nearly torn itself apart. Roy didn't waste the moment. He pushed through governance reforms that had been overdue for years: independent oversight committees, transparent reporting structures, protections against exactly the kind of internal manipulation that had almost cost him everything. He promoted Ethan into a formal executive leadership role, a recognition of years spent quietly learning every corner of the business from the ground up. Naomi Fletcher, whose 18 years of quiet diligence had ultimately been the thread that unraveled the entire conspiracy, was named Corporate Records Director, with expanded authority specifically designed to prevent any future tampering with the company's archive. Claire, for her part, accepted a permanent position as Chief Legal Counsel for Donnelly Global Logistics. Roy made the offer carefully, aware of how it might look to outsiders after everything that had just happened. "You don't have to take it because you're my daughter," he told her. "I need you to take it because you're the best attorney I've ever seen in a courtroom." "I know why you're offering it," Claire said, "and I'm taking it for the same reason." Months later, on a quiet afternoon with no reporters and no cameras, Roy drove out to the old warehouse where Donnelly Global Logistics had started, the same rented lot where he'd once kept 2 trucks and a stack of invoices he couldn't quite pay on time. The company had long since outgrown the space, but Roy kept the lease active anyway, unwilling to let it go entirely. Claire met him there, having driven separately after a morning of meetings downtown. She found him standing near the old loading dock, watching a line of freight trucks pull out of the newer facility half a mile down the road, their taillights catching the late afternoon sun. "You still come out here," she said, walking up beside him. Every so often, Roy didn't take his eyes off the trucks. "Reminds me where it all started. Keeps things in perspective." Claire reached into her bag and withdrew something small, wrapped in the same worn cloth Roy had once kept it in, tucked away in a drawer for years before he'd finally returned it to her, the week after the trial ended. "The brass key." She placed it gently into his palm. "You gave me this when I finally had a home," she said, "a door that would always be mine, no matter what." Roy looked down at it, the metal still smooth from decades of handling, worn soft at the edges, in a way that new keys never are. "Today," Claire said, closing his fingers gently around it, "I'm giving you back the future you built, because none of it would still be standing without the man who gave me that key in the first place." Roy stood there for a long moment, the key warm in his closed hand, watching the trucks disappear one by one down the road toward the horizon, carrying freight to places he'd never see, built on a foundation he'd laid one exhausting, uncertain year at a time. He understood something in that moment that no balance sheet, no valuation, no boardroom victory could ever fully capture. The company was real, the billions were real, but none of it was the thing he was actually proudest of. The thing he was proudest of was standing right beside him, having just walked into a federal courtroom and dismantled a conspiracy built by people with more money and less character than she'd ever have to worry about matching. He slipped the key into his jacket pocket, close to his chest, exactly where it had been the night he'd first held it 15 years earlier, waiting to be given away to a frightened little girl who needed, more than anything else, someone willing to stop. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.